Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Foundation for Open Society, Duets, it's my great pleasure to welcome you here for the 7th Isaiah Berlin anniversary memorial lecture. So I'm not sure whether it's the 7th time. It's already, we can say it's traditional. Is it tradition if we're making that for the 7th time, or is it not? But still, it's, for us, it's really a symbol of continuity in two senses. First of all, let's say the figure of Isaiah Berlin is, of course, for us here in Latvia, a symbol of the continuity of liberal culture, of multiculturalism, free exchange of thought, which links actually us with the time when Isaiah Berlin and his family were residing here in Riga. But Isaiah Berlin is also the figure of continuity in a second sense, in the institutional sense. And it concerns our transformation, the transformation of the Soros Foundation Latvia, which was one of the organizers of the last Isaiah Berlin memorial lectures, to the Foundation for Open Society, Duets, which, despite its changed institutional form and despite the absence of the previously generous funding, we are keeping our previous aims and our previous values. And from that point of view, of course, Isaiah Berlin is an important event also for our future, and we will stick to that tradition also in the future. Besides, this is of course not the only event we are organizing this year. Probably it's worth to mention that our foundation, Foundation for the Open Society Duets, is organizing on the 3rd and 4th of July the first open-air debate festival in Cēsis, which is called Lampa, where you are also kindly invited. But I'm not going to take your time much more. My task is actually just to introduce our distinguished speakers, without whom actually this event wouldn't be possible, and we really appreciate your help and your presence here today. This is, of course, Mr. David Herman, but our, let's say, the people who will be talking now, this is Robert Cottrell, who is going to introduce to us our distinguished guest, the editor of Isaiah Berlin's works, Henry Hardy. Please, Robert, the floor is yours.
Right, gosh, it's a pleasure to be back in this gracious room, in this gracious building, in this gracious city. As you know, we're just a mile away from the house in which Isaiah Berlin was born in 1909, and the purpose of the nature of this memorial lecture is that we can remember, celebrate, and profit from Isaiah Berlin's association with this city. I'm going to echo Ivars' thanks to Dortz and to the European Commission and to Satori and to Delphi, who've generously supported the lecture this year, as they have for 7 years, and I do hope we are now a fixture in the Riga calendar. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Henry Hardy, who is an honorary fellow of Wolfson College, Oxford. He's one of Isaiah Berlin's literary trustees, and he is, in my humble opinion, the finest editor on God's green earth. And let me enlarge on that a little bit, because it was said of Augustus that he found Rome brick and left it marble. Now, I think of Henry Hardy as finding Isaiah Berlin's works as a pile of bricks and leaving them not as a marble, but as a marvel. And I don't by that mean to disparage the bricks at all. They're beautiful bricks. They are some of the most intelligent bricks ever cast in the 20th century. However, they were scattered. They were scattered journalism, 150 essays and notes in different newspapers and magazines never collected, untranscribed lectures drawers full of notes. I think when Henry Hardy and Isaiah Berlin first met in 1972, Isaiah Berlin was at the height of his fame, but his published works amounts to one book, which was many, many years old at that point, a biography of Karl Marx, and one collection of essays, the 4 essays on liberty, which happily was the spark which kindled Henry's bonfire. So out of the crooked timber of notes and videos and newspaper journalism and desks of scraps of paper and diaries, Henry has so far given us, and I think now we're very close to the end, 17 books of collected writings and soon to be 4 volumes of collected letters. Now, I think what's really important here, to carry on with the bricks metaphor, is that what Henry's done is to give Isaiah Berlin's work a structure, and it's a monumental structure, and the structure is vital for 3 reasons, I think. The first is that you need a monumental structure which is going to tower over the intellectual landscape so that it can be seen from miles away and it cannot be ignored. You need a monumental structure because it advertises the scale of the treasures within, and most important of all, it's weatherproof. It resists the ravages of time. So with Henry's work in collecting, construing, publishing, consolidating the canon, Isaiah Berlin is as close as a human being can be to immortal. Now, the pinnacles and the towers of that structure are going to be, I would guess, the essays on liberalism, the essays on Russian thinkers, but there are also delights to be had in the lower and more accessible rooms. And I would particularly recommend to you the 4th volume of letters, which is coming out in the summer, which I think the letters, the 4 volumes, are a masterpiece of social history. Whether they will rank higher or lower than Berlin's masterpieces of philosophy, I'm not sure, but these are certainly 2 works for the ages. Now, it was said of Berlin that he was the greatest conversationalist of his time, a mantle which I would guess he inherited from Virginia Woolf and passed on to Tom Stoppard. Now, that Berlin is lost to us. I think we're never going to, unfortunately, to sit at table and talk directly to Berlin. The letters are as close as we can get to Berlin, the talker, and they are every bit as amusing and distracting as the best conversation could possibly be. Whereas the closest we can get to Isaiah Berlin, the thinker and the writer, happily, is by listening to Henry Hardy, who was his friend and his colleague and his editor for 25 years. And Henry has also been a good friend to the Isaiah Berlin Day in Riga since our first event in 2009. So, Henry Hardy, it's a particular delight to make way for you to deliver the 7th Isaiah Berlin Riga Memorial Lecture on Isaiah Berlin's view of human nature.
On such occasions, Isaiah Berlin himself always said, "It's always much nicer to receive more than one's due than to receive one's due." And I know exactly what he meant. Thank you, Robert, for that enormously generous introduction, which I shall have to have transcribed and hung in a frame over my bed, I think. I begin with 3 parish notices. First of all, whenever I quote, usually Berlin, but not always, I will put the words on the screen so that I don't have to say quote unquote or I quote or anything like that. That's my system. Secondly, I use a lot of clips of Berlin talking, and I've put subtitles on them because a lot of people find Berlin's voice difficult to follow, and perhaps some of you did in David's film. and also the sound quality of some of the films is not what it might be. But actually, I thought that the technicians made a very, very good job of David's film, and the sound quality was much better than when I watch it on my own television at home. So perhaps the subtitles are necessary, but I can't take them off now. And the third announcement is that there is inevitably some overlap with David Herman's film, so those of you who have seen it will recognize some of the themes that were treated there coming up here. I don't think that matters. The famous philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein once said about his colleague G.E. Moore, repetition is not clarification. I think that repetition often is clarification. Say it again. And I hope that this is one of those cases rather than an occasion for boredom. Those are my announcements. So, in 1994, Isaiah Berlin accepted an honorary doctorate from Toronto University. His acceptance address was a short credo, as he called it, published last year in the New York Review of Books as a message to the 21st century. In this address, he spoke of the 20th century as our own terrible century and referred to the horrors that it contained. I was to try this laser. Does it work? Yes, there you go. There's the horrors. Here he is saying something similar in 1995.
The worst century it's ever been. From the point of view of cruel human inhumanity, of savage destruction of mankind for no good reason, of the reign of irrationalism called rationalism. There'll be no century in which so many people, so many innocent people have perished so horribly.
In the Toronto address, he also said something provocative about these horrors. They were, in my view, not caused by the ordinary negative human sentiments, as Spinoza called them, fear, greed, tribal hatreds, jealousy, love of power, though of course these have played their wicked part. They have been caused in our time by ideas. The most disastrous idea for Berlin was that there is one single solution to human problems, one right way for us to live, which should, according to those who believe in it, be imposed by force, if necessary, on those who are too misguided to accept it. He insisted that this idea is false, invoking his familiar doctrine that the values we subscribe to and the cultures they help to compose are often incompatible, and that there is no uniquely correct resolution of conflicts between them. This is his main argument when he rejects ideologically driven political violence of the kind resorted to by fundamentalists, fanatics, and extremists of all kinds, especially those inspired, or should I say brainwashed, by religious certainty, such as contemporary Islamist jihadists.
Terrorists usually are fanatics in some way who believe that they know the truth. And they don't do it just for the hell of it, I don't think. They do it, they sometimes risk their lives. They may be mad, and they may be destructive, and the truths which they believe in may not be true at all, and may be extremely dangerous and bad. But they do believe in them. And therefore, in a sense, it's a kind of boredom, I think, with an excessively tolerant liberal society, and a return back to some sort of original effort to find some sort of absolutely inexpugnable truths, in the name of which you can do these terrible things.
Berlin's response to this kind of blind certainty is unequivocal.
I believe that all search for a final solution to human ills, that there is one particular structure of life for everybody, if only we could get there, which would satisfy all the proper human needs and rights. That the search for that invariably leads to blood.
But despite the horrors, Berlin was optimistic.
I'm in a mildly optimistic condition. I think we just, there are dollars, and I believe that.
They believe it. And lots of people in Algiers may believe it. And certainly some Muslims clearly do believe it. And no doubt there are neo-fascists and there probably are unreconstructed communists, for all we know, somewhere in Cuba, who may believe in this. But they don't believe it as strongly as they did. There is more, I mean, I'm more optimistic because I think the idea that people mustn't impose themselves too strongly on other people, that people should try and seek protect their form of life, but not too strongly, not so strongly as to suppress other people. That is better understood now than for a long, long time.
Now you can leave the lights down as far as I'm concerned. I think it's better for the screen if they're down. Thank you. We may think this optimism of Berlin's less justified today, but let's hope we are wrong. Anyway, we have to deal with the threat posed by fanatics. And even if ideas lie behind what they do, it is of course more than a battle of ideas that faces us. Even if in the long term we hope to see changes in hearts and minds, in the short term we have to resist with stronger methods. Berlin always emphasized the power of ideas, and he was right to do so. When ideas affect our lives, we need to understand them. When they are mistaken or malign, we need to counter them in their own terms. To adapt a well-known saying, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil ideas is that good ideas are not brought forward to challenge them. Nevertheless, Berlin sometimes gave ideas too large a role, perhaps because he was an intellectual. When a national leader stimulates an unjustified territorial war, or annexes part of another nation's land, or invades another nation, or plots against his opponents, he may try to rationalize his actions for the benefit of public opinion, but his true motivation may not be ideological. It may have more to do with the negative human sentiments that Berlin spoke of than with the reasons that the leader appeals to publicly. Berlin believed in calling a spade a spade. Desire for power is desire for power, however it may be dressed up, and cannot be curbed by argument about its justification, however persuasive. Berlin sometimes accepted this, as when President Kennedy suggested to him that somebody ought to write a proper analysis of Stalin's philosophy.
That I thought was a meaningless proposition, because Stalin had no philosophy, apart from decaying Marxism.
But at other times, he didn't accept it, as when he wrote this in a 1981 letter. All empires bent on acquisition, retention, and extension must be animated by some kind of ideology which justifies their conduct to themselves. This is true of Rome, France, Britain, everybody. So too the Russians. But it does not dictate the tactics or even the strategy, the purpose of which is the extension of power without consideration of ultimate ends, whatever such extensions may be. Rich men seldom ask themselves what exactly the advantages of being richer and richer may be, nor do states, though usually ideologues try to justify it, and other ideologues criticize it. Whatever the truth is, international law sets limits to the ways in which existing political boundaries can be legitimately altered. Of course, these boundaries are as they are now because of past acts of aggression that would not be countenanced today. But we have to start from where we are. If we try to imagine a world in which none of our contemporary boundaries exist, and then ask how we should organize the governance of this world, we should hardly know how to begin. So we draw a line and say, this is how things are now, and if you want to change them, these are the rules. We shall, of course, argue about where we draw this line. Do we draw it before or after the creation of the State of Israel? Before or after the Baltic states gained their independence from the Soviet Union? before or after the Chinese government incorporated Tibet? Is it a question of how long ago a change occurred? Is it a question of whether the change was welcomed by the people who are most directly affected by it? Are both considerations relevant? It's difficult or impossible to generalize, but in some cases, I believe I know the right way to decide, and so do you. I mention these questions about boundaries because they seem relevant in Riga, but I want to open a wider perspective. Berlin took human life in general as his canvas, which makes the questions he raises deeper and wider and more numerous. Why should anyone obey anyone else? Who should obey whom? How should we live? What moral and political principles should we accept, and why? Libraries are filled with attempts to answer questions like this, but there is one thing that all the attempts have in common. Underlying every one of them is some conception of human nature. This may differ from person to person, but it drives all such discussions, even if it's not made explicit. The 19th century British philosopher John Stuart Mill wrote, "The first question in regard to any man of speculation is, what is his theory of human life?" Not every thinker tells us what his theory of human life is. He may not even be fully aware of it. Mill adds, in the minds of many philosophers, whatever theory they have is latent, and it would be a revelation to themselves to have it pointed out to them in their writings, as others can see it, unconsciously moulding everything to its own likeness. Both of Mill's observations apply to Berlin, whose conception of humanity is worth trying to understand, if only because he was himself such a richly engaging and wise human being. His writings are all founded, more or less directly, on a view of human nature, human life, and human potential. He never makes a systematic attempt to spell out in full what his conception of humanity is. This is not a project for him, unfortunately. So we have a task to perform, to elicit the unspoken vision that informs all he says and does and is. He accepted that this would be an enlightening strategy. When these passages from Mill were quoted in a review of one of his books, he wrote to the reviewer, "I think the quotation from Mill about the possibility of revealing to writers that about themselves which can only be perceived by another observer, which no introspection discloses, is absolutely true in this case." And he once wrote in words that apply just as much to his own case, "The ideas of every philosopher concerned with human affairs, in the end, rest on his conception of what man is and can be. To understand such thinkers, it's more important to grasp this central notion or image, which may be implicit, but determines their picture of the world, than even the most forceful arguments with which they defend their views and refute actual and possible objections." Encouraged by such remarks, I shall point to a few important features of Berlin's conception of human nature, deducing them from scattered remarks of his. In order to bring his views to life, I shall continue to illustrate them with clips from filmed interviews. What he wrote was sometimes clearer and less vulnerable to criticism than his impromptu remarks, but the way in which he speaks is part of his message. His lively engagement is a good advertisement for the life of the mind. I'm going to make use of a metaphor. My metaphor is drawn from architecture. All buildings need both foundations and superstructures. You can't live in foundations, but if you build a superstructure on inadequate foundations, it will collapse. The same is true of human morality and human cultures. Let me start with the foundations. Foundations have to pass certain tests. They have to be deep enough and strong enough to support what is built on them. Whatever kind of finished building is visible above ground, the requirements to be met by foundations are similar. Identical foundations could support Riga Cathedral or the large Guild, the Radisson Blu hotels, or the House of the Blackheads. In the same way, There are certain general principles to be found in all sensible, decent moralities and cultures, even though what we see on the surface varies enormously. How do we discover what these essential foundations are? In architecture, we turn to the history of building. We learn from the experience of builders through the ages which foundations work and which don't. Wooden foundations rot. Shallow or narrow foundations move under the weight of what is built on them. So it is in morality and culture. To discover the essential foundations of any viable society, we turn to historical and contemporary experience of human beings with a secular version of Reinhold Niebuhr's Serenity Prayer as our guide. Grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. In our study of human nature, too, we need to be able to distinguish what we are stuck with from what we can alter and act accordingly. Berlin's starting point is our shared experience of life. This is something we all have in common, something that cannot be gainsaid. Here he is stating this clearly and briefly.
A lot of my ideas are deeply affected by British empiricism. One only knows what one knows, or thinks what one thinks, as a result of experience. By experience, I mean the five senses and everything which goes with them. Thought, imagination, and the five senses, but not from some transcendent source.
Transcendent means going beyond human experience. The transcendent sources Berlin rejects include religious revelation, mysticism, blind obedience to convention or authority, teleological theories of historical inevitability, and any other systems of ideas untethered to reality. These are not sources we can appeal to in a way that all sane people will accept. Because he is a liberal, he must tolerate those who believed in such alleged routes to enlightenment, so long as they tolerate in return. But these sources, especially religions, notoriously disagree. And if our aim is maximum consensus, we need to rely on something more down to earth, which is why Berlin bases his convictions on what is in plain sight. The most basic truth that experience shows him is that there is indeed such a thing as human nature, and that this explains why we have the values and cultures that we do. In his credo, he says, "The ends pursued by human beings are all generated by our common nature." This may seem too obvious to need stating, but many have denied it, and many have tried to impose arrangements that do violence to the nature that we cannot shed. What is our shared nature? When we look at human beings dispassionately in the light of history, certain general truths about them strike us. We see what they want, we see what they need, and we see what moral principles they follow. These are different things, and we should keep them separate. We may want things that we don't need or can't have, such as limitless wealth or immortality. We may need things that we don't want, like education or a healthy diet. We may subscribe to principles or practices that are superstitious or mistaken or wrong, such as the divine right of kings or racism or slavery. Berlin sometimes runs these different things together. Here is one example.
What we can tell is what people actually want. That is empirically discoverable. We can find out what people want, and we can find out what makes people happy, and we can find out what makes people contented and what satisfies their basic needs, not only for food and shelter and security, but also for self-expression, for freedom, for all the things which men in general, and particularly men in our day, obviously do feel. Now, if we can discover that, that is what any system which provides them with as much of that as possible is an acceptable system and has some kind of way we can defend it on the grounds that at least we have some sort of empirical basis for doing what we're doing. We say we give it to as many people as possible, as many of the things they want as possible, provided they don't prevent other people from getting the things they want.
Berlin's point here is that amidst all the disagreement about how society should be organized, we can at least make a solid start by sticking to obvious facts about people about what people want or need. He mentions both wants and needs in the same sentence without addressing the difference between them. Which is the better foundation for morality? Perhaps the ideal is to persuade people to want what they need, if that were possible. This is partly what education is about, and Berlin recognizes that education is crucial in maintaining a decent society. But the important claim here is that we should base our political arrangements on the actual nature of real human beings and not on some transcendent dispensation that cannot be held to account at the bar of experience. A supposedly sacred text like the Bible or the Quran, or a cultural tradition based on false beliefs, or followed simply because it is a tradition, even though it flouts our common humanity, like the Asian practice of sati, which was mentioned in David's film, which is the suicide of widows on their husbands' funeral pyres, or female circumcision, or other forms of the oppression of women. There's little disagreement about the most basic needs of human beings. We need food, we need drink, we need shelter, we need companionship, we need hope for the future, we need a form of life that makes sense to us, we need social order and protection from arbitrary violence. We are social and political animals as well as biological organisms, and we need a society that functions and serves our needs. This means we need a set of basic rules for communal living that are widely accepted and enforced. When Berlin talks about these shared rules, he often makes the point that they enable us to communicate with and understand other human beings, however different they may be on the surface.
I can only talk to people who understand what I mean. However different their morality is from mine, they must be able to understand a certain minimum.
This understanding requires shared values.
There's a certain number of common values in terms of which human beings can communicate.
And he gives examples.
Communication must be possible, because there are these common values. I mean, everybody believes in truth, because if you didn't have truth, you couldn't live, because then if lies were told, you didn't know what to expect in the future. Everybody has to eat, everyone has to drink, everyone has to have a certain amount of sexual exercise. These things are common. If you cross these things out, people cease to communicate.
The point about communication is important for Berlin. He assumes that any human being at any time can understand any other human being because all human beings share certain needs and values and beliefs. If they didn't, each individual, or at any rate each culture, would be trapped in a box without windows. Berlin doesn't argue for this assumption, though one may hope or believe that it's true. Given his general empiricism, it must come from experience. I suppose it's an anthropological claim. I'm not sure whether experience does always completely justify it. How far could we converse with a caveman? Anyway, Berlin looks at human beings through time and across the world and sees communication and shared attitudes. Sometimes he seems to defend the possibility of communication because without it the outlook would be bleak. That, of course, is not a good argument, and occasionally he seems to risk circularity. We must be able to communicate because we have a shared nature. We must have a shared nature because we can communicate. Which comes first? Is our understanding of others illusory? Are we more different from each other than we suppose? These are questions that he does not address, and so I leave them on one side here. Berlin holds that if there are no shared attitudes, then communication breaks down.
There is a man who goes about plunging knives into other people. And you say to him, why do you do this? He says, because it gives me pleasure. And you say, but you know, it hurts these people. And the man says, yes, but what of it? And then you say, but you know, if you do it to them, they might do it to you. No, they won't, because I'm stronger than they are. I can defend myself. They can't defend themselves, so I do it to them. So far,
who can understand what is happening. Sadism is something which we recognize as a possible human condition. But now the conversation goes on, and you say, but why do you enjoy plunging knives into them? He said, because it causes them pain? No. My reason is I like putting knives into resilient surfaces, like people's skin. So if I give you a tennis ball, you put your knife into that, would that give you equal pleasure? Yes. Makes no difference whether you cause pain to human beings or kill them or just put the knife into some other resilient surface. I don't see what you mean when it says, I told you, what I like is plunging knives into resilient surfaces. Then you don't understand how such a man can think what his world is, what his values are. I think we'll begin to say, communication is broken down. I can't go on. I can't discuss it any further.
There's one important feature of the needs and values that humans share that Berlin often stresses. These needs and values are not, he says, absolute, not a priori. That is, they are not part of the eternal fabric of the universe, something that has to be true in all possible worlds, something that can be guaranteed to remain the same through all time and space. Instead, they arise from our actual world of human experience, which is contingent, that is, which might have been different. Our species might have been different in the past, or now, or might change in the future. There might have been more than one species with moral beliefs and practices, and the different species might have been opaque to one another, unless we think that the non-human features of the world set a limit to what kind of intelligent creatures could successfully live in it. But this isn't a very plausible belief, given the myriad species that actually do live in it, most of which have no need or understanding of human values, even if they do share some of our more basic biological needs. Maybe there actually were intelligent beings with a different nature in the past. Maybe there were, or are, or will be such beings elsewhere in the universe, as science fiction imagines. Why does it matter whether our shared values are eternal or empirical, absolute or subject to change? One reason it matters is that if they are contingent, as Berlin supposes, then we don't need to appeal to any alleged superhuman authority, which is sometimes used as a way of justifying inhuman behavior. We can insist instead on applying the simple test that values must be true to experience.
There are certain propositions, certain values, if you like, which a great many people, at a great many times, in a great many places, have believed and have accepted. And that makes communication between different cultures possible. Some people think these things are a priori. Some people think these are so-called values which are given to us by God or by our own conscience, or by whatever it may be. That I don't believe. I do not believe in the possibility of discovering anything, any factual truth a priori. But there are certain quasi-universal truths which most people have lived in the light of. And that is why they are not strange to us. If there were people who really did not accept these basic propositions, we wouldn't understand them, and we wouldn't think they were human. So there is something common to all human beings and all cultures, but it is not guaranteed. It is not a priori.
This is the refusal of guarantees that I've already referred to. It's a vivid way of emphasizing that our nature and our values are not written in the fabric of eternity, but are accidental features of a real world that could have been quite different.
I can't guarantee anything. I can guarantee nothing. Guarantees are a way of denying experience as the only measure.
In any case, we don't need absolute values. The values we share, values that might perhaps have been different, give us enough common ground for mutual understanding.
That's good enough. That's a good empirical substitute for the eternal a priori values which I've never discovered. I don't want to call them universal because that makes them forever. I think changes can occur. At least I can't say that they can't. Maybe they haven't.
Berlin's account of the widespread beliefs shared by most human beings does blur the distinction between what we believe and what is true. The fact that something is widely believed cannot be enough by itself to make us accept it, of course. At one time, most people believed that the sun went round the earth, but this doesn't mean that the sun goes round the earth. There have been times when false beliefs have been widely held and harmful moral and political principles have been based upon them. It's the task of scientists and philosophers to examine beliefs and reject them when they are unjustified. There is no empirical basis for the belief that Jews are an inferior race, or women an inferior sex, and so no moral basis for anti-Semitism or sexual discrimination. If we want to know what requirements human nature suggests, we cannot just appeal to majority beliefs. We must also ask whether such beliefs are justified, and if not, what truer beliefs should be put in their place. The price of truth, just like the price of liberty, is eternal vigilance. We must always test claims about human nature against human nature as it actually is. Nevertheless, the fact that a moral principle has been widely accepted across times and places and cultures is one strong piece of evidence in its favour, and this is what Berlin has in mind when he offers such principles as the basis of a successful social order. Berlin never provides a complete list of the values and beliefs that human beings share, but it would be possible to draw up a partial list by adding together all the examples he gives at different times. One basic principle that has high priority for him is that the first duty of any public authority is to eliminate as much suffering as possible.
Avoidable suffering is what has to be avoided.
This may seem like a truism, but it's far from being so, as the terrible 20th century and the beginning of the 21st show beyond doubt. Tell it to the Gestapo, tell it to the KGB, tell it to Islamic State. But it's Berlin's moral ground zero, and it means that people should never be trampled on for whatever purpose.
Trampling is what I most strongly object to all my life.
Let me give you one example of how we can glean other principles that are required by Berlin's view of human nature. Here is a clip from a discussion of whether democracy is a sufficient way of arranging for people to get what they need.
There are certain rules, apart from democracy, which I think we have to observe, which are what is called human rights. Unless there is a minimum of human rights by which we say, even if the majority wants it, we can't allow people to murder each other. We can't allow people to burn witches. You say public institutions deprave people, they brutalize people. We can't have that. And you say, but the majority want it. You say, never mind. Never mind. There are certain rules which must really be binding upon people, and which they must know to be binding. Otherwise, society can't function at all. Otherwise, you get into the impossible position of saying anything the majority wants is all right. And so we still cling, even in our so-called ungovernable society, to certain basic ground rules. We think on the whole that people should not be allowed to bear false witness in law courts. People shouldn't be allowed to pass retrospective legislation which makes people out to be guilty of things which were not illegal at the time when they did them, and that kind of thing.
From this clip, we can extract 5 rules. No murder, no burning of witches, no public executions, no lying in court, and no retrospective legislation. Rules 2 and 3 are, of course, special cases of Rule 1, but they are worth spelling out separately. From other passages, we can deduce other principles, such as the prohibition of cruelty, of torture, of assault, or any arbitrary use of force or imprisonment. Rules of this kind are offered as necessary ingredients in a successful and stable society, and they are offered simply on the basis of experience, of common sense, if you like, not on the basis of what, in one of the earlier clips, he called some transcendent source. This should mean that every reasonable person will accept the principles, which can therefore be built into all moralities and political codes, just as all buildings must have foundations that meet certain basic specifications. There isn't likely to be much disagreement about principles as basic as these, though all of them have been widely flouted. Things get more interesting when we ask which other principles belong in the foundations and which are instead part of the varied superstructures that we can build on the foundations. The foundations are compulsory, but the forms of the superstructures are optional. And as soon as we assign a principle to the superstructure rather than to the foundations, we allow that it may be excluded from a perfectly acceptable culture. Windows don't need to have any particular shape to perform their function. If the suicide of Asian widows is seen as like having windows of an unfamiliar shape, then it's hard to see how we can object to it. But if it's seen as flouting one of the fundamental principles of human society, namely the prohibition of killing, it's like having defective foundations, and we shan't hesitate to oppose it. It does matter which of these ways of viewing a practice is right. If we draw the boundaries of basic human principles too narrowly, we risk ending up with relativism, which makes moral principles more like matters of taste. Liberalism for the liberals, cannibalism for the cannibals, as it has been put. Or to take an example of relativism from Berlin himself, I am in favor of kindness, and you prefer concentration camps. Although we may be able to explain cannibalism and concentration camps in terms of the beliefs of those who are responsible for them, we naturally want to say that these beliefs are false and that the practices are morally repellent. Basic human rules founded on basic human needs are broken, and the practices must be rejected with all the means at our disposal. If, on the other hand, we draw the boundaries of human nature too widely, we end up with absurd claims about what all human beings must do to remain human. Say, drink afternoon tea, or dress for dinner, or shake hands. These examples may seem ludicrous, but we can find others that aren't. Missionaries, fundamentalists, totalitarians, and imperialists have notoriously imposed alien ways on cultures that have no need of them and may be damaged by them. Even when we are clearly in the realm of the optional superstructure, there are restrictions to be observed. Here, too, architecture provides a parallel. However various our buildings may be, they have to observe the laws of physics if they are to remain standing. Roofs have to shed water. Walls have to withstand wind or earthquakes. Windows have to be translucent. Similarly, culturally specific practices must be consistent with the limitations set by human nature. Berlin used to express this by saying that human nature generated a limited number of values, say 74 or 122, some of which we find in one culture, some in another. Similarly, the laws of physics set a limit to the number of different kinds of buildings that we can erect and still end up with a sound structure that fulfills the purpose for which it was built. But although human nature sets limits to what is morally or politically acceptable in the variable region of a culture, what concerns me today is the more basic question: which core ingredients, in addition to those we have already seen Berlin identifying, belong in a full account of our shared human nature? For Berlin, one of the most important of these core ingredients is the capacity for choice. Human beings, for him, are nothing if they are not beings that choose. This is at the heart of his liberalism, and he repeatedly insists on it.
Basic choice is a psychological presupposition of being a human being, not a robot.
Basic choice means the capacity to choose between two or more options, the possession of free will, if you like. And Berlin believes that choice is a defining characteristic of humanity.
If people can't choose, they're not quite human. It's part of what is we human, part of the definition of being human, certainly.
And for Berlin, choice is so crucial to humans that mere choosing is more important than choosing sensibly.
I'd rather have the right to choose to get to the bed than no right to choose at all, even if this makes me happy. Now, this is a very deep human desire, certainly, and seems to be part of what we mean by human nature. I think anyone who thinks human beings out like that is in some way frustrating something very essential to human beings.
So for Berlin, the capacity for choice that is basic in human nature crucially includes the choice of what to make of our lives. We want to make our own life choices, good or bad, and not to be dictated to, even by a benevolent dictator. It's an equally important fact for Berlin that human nature generates values that clash, as we saw in David's film. We cannot have complete justice and full mercy. Liberty and excellence can conflict with equality, efficiency with spontaneity, honesty and truth with kindness, and so on. And the same is true of different cultures. Can one be simultaneously a good Muslim and a good Latvian? Nor can there be rules that enable us to choose between clashing values or cultures in a definitive way. One choice may be no better or worse than another. This means that life is full of choices that cannot be guided by abstract principles. We are on our own and have to construct our lives as best we can. When we put our capacity to choose alongside our need to choose, we have the two main ingredients in Berlin's case for liberalism, which holds that people should, on the whole, be left alone, free to make their own decisions. Berlin said that his work was founded on the belief that
people are the best judges of what they wanted to be, or what they wanted to do. And there's nothing else very much matter compared to that.
And so for him, a liberal society is the best option.
And I want the choices to be what I call liberal choices. I believe that, there is some forms of life which is superior to other forms of life. I think that liberal society is superior to a dictatorship. You're right in supposing that the thing which probably is the strongest sentiment in me as far as moral politics is concerned is the belief that what matters most are human beings, the liberty of human beings to shape their lives, to have whatever personal relations they feel like having, to do whatever they're impelled to do.
Another of the basic human needs stressed by Berlin, which I mentioned earlier, is the need to belong to a group of like-minded people. This, I take it, is something that is especially well understood in the Baltic republics, better, no doubt, than in an island nation like my own, though we too experience threats to this kind of belonging.
People want to live with other people whose language they understand, whose habits are natural to them, so they don't have to explain things to them. People want to live among people with whom they can communicate without, so to speak, effort. And that means to have a comfortable life. Hegel once said that freedom was by sich selbst sein, to be at home. That is a perfectly valid form of desire for living among your own people.
Berlin regarded this as a central human need, up there with the need for food and drink, and rejected cosmopolitanism, which says that the only unit we need to belong to is the whole world. We define ourselves in part by our membership of a group that differs from other groups. Difference, that is part of our identity. If all cultures were dissolved into a single whole, the result would not be a single culture, but the death of culture, according to Berlin. This is a strong and controversial claim, and I have my doubts about it, but it is certainly one Berlin makes. Berlin's name for one of the most widespread forms of this kind of belonging was national consciousness. This can, of course, easily become aggressive or self-congratulatory, and then Berlin calls it nationalism and rejects it.
I'm sympathetic to national consciousness, of people feeling that they belong to each other in virtue of common past, a common language, common outlook, and probably common memories. But when that becomes even inflamed, that's what I call nationalism, and that leads to horrors. So don't accuse me of being a nationalist. I'm an anti-nationalist. If you would say, my nation is superior to your nation, therefore I know how you should live, and you don't know how I should live, and I'm going to conquer you in order to show you how life should be lived. That will do.
His own vision of differing national identities is quite different and entirely peaceable.
If we have a lot of small societies, each of which is quite comfortable within itself, and they don't go to war against each other, because they understand the plurality of values, and that not all values are theirs, then all is well. I don't say this could happen. I'm being optimistic. That's the many flowers which Mao talked about. That's what Herder wanted. He wanted societies which were comfortable among themselves, but which congratulated other societies on being comfortable among themselves with quite different values. And no conflict. That is optimistic. That is not what has happened. But ideally, it was a good state of affairs.
An even more specific claim Berlin makes is that the need to belong sets limits to the watering down by multiculturalism of the unit of belonging.
I think it can go too far. I think that societies can only flourish if there is enough solidarity in them which presupposes some central tradition, linguistic, political, and other, to which the dissidents, to a large degree, I don't mean dissidents, but to which people who are different from it, to a large degree, accept and adhere. The complete differences, I mean, the idea of a kaleidoscope, of different traditions, different languages, all living in the same country. Switzerland is always given as an example of that. But Switzerland is very unique and exceptional. And even in Switzerland, the German Swiss incline towards the Germans, the French Swiss towards France, and the Italian Swiss towards Italy. They're quite glad to be Swiss because of the social forms which they observe. And they're neutral, they're happy, they're peaceful, they're rich. Who wouldn't want that? But it isn't really a multicultural society. I think one has to have some central tradition and a single language, which is the language of that country. But that's what's wrong in Canada at the moment, for example. The struggle in languages can be politically divisive. Well, some divisions, one accepts why shouldn't Norway have seceded from Sweden. I was in favor of Biafra.
Switzerland is perhaps unusual or unique. If Berlin is right, it represents a civic agreement between three main cultural groups who identify themselves more with the nations from which those cultures originate than with the political unit to which they formally belong. Can this model be applied to a nation like Latvia, where the main cultural group is not parasitic on the culture of another nation? I should not dare to give an opinion on that question. But if Berlin is right about the need for limits to cultural dilution, there is a real problem to face in any nation containing a large cultural minority whose deepest allegiance may lie elsewhere. So I've tried to show in action just a few of the main features of Berlin's conception of human nature. Taken together, they contribute to a definite view of what humans need to prosper and what works against their well-being. The struggle against inhuman or anti-human beliefs and behavior is never over, given the strong human propensity to act extremely badly. But there is no need for the struggle to be weakened by a feeble relativistic belief that anything goes, in which case it would be mere prejudice to prefer kindness to concentration camps. When an oppressive regime argues that Western liberal individualism is parochial and that a collectivist ideal requiring the subjection of the individual to the state is at least equally valid, or even superior. Our objection draws on our conception of what human beings of their very essence can do and be, and need to do and be. When the Chinese government says that certain human rights are merely Western rights, we should call their bluff. Human rights are human, not Western. If the government of Singapore appeals to Asian values to justify coercion, we should say that Asians are humans too. The Swedish foreign minister has denounced the subjugation of women in Saudi Arabia. She wasn't simply pitting Scandinavian culture against Arab culture, as claimed by the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which said she was failing to respect the world's rich and varied ethical standards. If she had been, there would have been no good grounds for her objections. She was appealing to universal human ethical standards. When Jacob Zuma said that xenophobia was against South African values, he was hijacking universal human values for his own political ends. If we say that a regime riddled with corruption that uses fear and intimidation as political instruments is anti-human, we are making a claim that ought to be defended at any time and place, defending a vision that is worth fighting for in the confidence that humanity, all humanity, is on our side. There is a famous quotation from the Roman playwright Terence. "I am a human being. I regard nothing that is human as alien to me." This can be turned around. I am a human being. I regard anything that is inhuman as alien to me. It's not a bad principle. Thank you.
Feast of thoughts, and just as we're digesting one succulent morsel from you or from Isaiah, another one is served up. Thank you for a wonderful lecture. I know we've heard several times that the need for food and drink is central to human nature, and we do have in mind a glass of wine afterwards, which should perhaps not be too long delayed. But I think it would be a pity to let the opportunity pass for any questions or comments that we might have. So, does anybody want to add anything at this point?
If you would much rather, if you would much rather go and eat and drink immediately, I shall not be in the least offended.
Right. I'm going to close off that avenue by asking you one question right away, Henry, which is that Isaiah Berlin was relatively silent in his published work on the question of the Holocaust. And sorry, on the question, does this work? On the question of the Holocaust. And
it doesn't. Have you got one that does? Can you make it work?
Can you make it work? Thank you.
It should be working.
Very good. Thank you so much. And I wondered if you have any clues or if there are any fragments to indicate how the facts of the Holocaust fit in with or don't fit in with Berlin's ideas about human nature. I mean, did he feel that a large proportion of Germany had in effect resigned from the human race for a period, or did he feel that he could communicate with them, that in a sense genocide was more rational than stabbing tennis balls?
You've asked one of the most difficult questions that can be asked about Berlin's ideas, and I don't know how good an answer I can give, but he certainly always maintained that the Nazis were not insane. They were not like the man who is sticking a knife into human flesh or indifferently into tennis balls. They were people who somehow or another became convinced of a monstrous falsehood which is that there are that Jews are subhumans, are a threat to real humans and need to be suppressed or eliminated. So he thinks that you can understand the Nazi views and that they are sane human beings, but obviously mistaken and evil, but not insane. Does that help at all?
Yes, and it provokes another thought, and I hope I'm not cutting anybody else off, but just to ask whether, in a sense, the logical monstrosity of that point of view, that what the Nazis were doing was not insane, whether that would account for Berlin's apparent reluctance to write at length on this subject, because he didn't want to, as it were, put his name to a proposition which he knew most people would find intolerable.
It's possible. I haven't thought of that. His own account of why he didn't write about the Holocaust was that he had nothing to add to what everybody thought about it. It was self-evidently appalling and monstrous and the worst collective crime that had ever been perpetrated by humanity against other human beings. And this would have been said by hundreds of people. There was also a theory that he felt in some way self-conscious about not having stood up more publicly against the Holocaust during the course of the Second World War, when most people who look into it believe he must have known about it quite early on. And it was well known about in both England and America by 1942, at the latest, and yet he says he didn't know about it until 1944 or even early 1945. I've been into this quite a lot because of passages in his letters where he discusses it, and I simply find this impossible to believe. And the only theory I can come up with is that he felt guilty about not having taken a more principled and public stand, not having urged the Zionist leaders to stand out against what was being done more than he did. This was, if you like, a general feature of his political life. He always tended to see both sides of a question and sit on the fence, but in this case, there can be no... You can't put that into this category. So there's something odd going on there, which I still haven't got to the bottom of. David may well have ideas.
Sorry. Thank you for the interesting talk. I was quite intrigued by the thought you raised about national consciousness and how that was an important thing for Isaiah Berlin, and how he thought it's important for human beings to live a comfortable life. I was wondering if you could comment on how do you think Isaiah Berlin thought about, and how maybe he would have thought about supranational projects like the European Union, which to some extent limit national sovereignty and limit the national consciousness above and beyond the basic human rights that Isaiah Berlin talks about. How do you think he would have interpreted such a project?
Well, I think you saw part of his answer in David's film, where he was asked about European culture. Okay, that's a cultural identity rather than a political identity, but I think the same would apply. That's to say, he believed that there was such a thing as European culture, from which we may deduce that he would accept that there may be such a thing as European political identity, but he also said that it didn't undermine or attack the separate identities of the nations that composed it. So I think he thought the two were compatible.
To take you back to the question of communication, and communication only really being possible where there were shared moral values, and to think in terms of what is happening today, not far from this country in Ukraine. How do you think Isaiah Berlin would have reacted to what is happening there today, and what kind of view or what kind of advice, if you were to give any, would he give to Mrs. Merkel, to Mrs. Mogherini, or to Mr. Kerry in their discussions with Vladimir Putin?
Goodness, what a difficult question. He would have been, I'm certain that he would have been appalled by what's happening in the Ukraine. There's no doubt about that. He would have regarded the behavior of the rebels and their Russian supporters as unacceptable. He would have wanted Angela Merkel and anyone else to do everything they possibly could to bring pressure on Russia to stop behaving in that way. But in the end, as we must all admit, there is a limit to what we can do to prevent people from misbehaving within their own boundaries or near to their own boundaries in parts of the world where we have no particular machinery for resisting. And you know, there isn't an obvious perfect solution for these situations. You just have to do what you can.
I must apologise, by the way, for not recognising faces as quickly as I should. It's very, very sort of dark in the hall. So can you, if there's any more questions, could you wave quite vigorously? Ivars, yes.
It probably can be a little besides the point, but my question would be like this. You have been talking about the Isaiah's Berlin conception of human nature from the point of view, let's say, philosophical ethics and political theory and so on and so forth. Taking into account your expertise in his work, would be his position regarding this tinkering with the very genetic basis of human nature, let's say, in the sense that, let's say, also the biological basis of human nature becomes actually an object of the liberal choice you have been mentioning. So, of course, I'm not sure whether he lived to get long enough to get, let's say, something of this discussion, but this discussion about the human nature might be pretty important in the future. So, thank you.
Absolutely, it's an interesting question. One thing I can say straight away is that he would not have been sympathetic to the absolutist stands taken by people who say that human nature was created by God and therefore should not be tampered with in any degree. He would have, I think, thought that the decisions should be subject to exactly the same kind of considerations that are involved in any discussion about political action or ethical action. That say that you look at the consequences so far as you can establish them as carefully as you can, you do your research with the best possible care you can, and you make what you think is the best decision. And like so many of us, he would no doubt think that the consequences of these kinds of changes that you talk about is very, very difficult to predict, and that it's very dangerous perhaps to make changes. But I don't think he would be against them in principle.
Let me throw in another one, if I may. Was there a big issue on which Isaiah Berlin ever changed his mind? I mean, you mentioned that he made a wrong political or practical call in the assessment of Nazi Germany, but at the level of philosophy, values, ideas, were there any ideas, strands of thought, which he fundamentally changed in the light of events?
Not really. No, he was remarkably consistent throughout his life. He had an attitude, I suppose, which was formed politically, was formed very much in his childhood, and everybody tells the story of how he was, it comes in the film, David's film, of how he was out with his governess in Petersburg, or Petrograd as it was then called, and saw a mob dragging a Tsarist policeman off to his death, and that formed his political personality, if you like. He certainly added to his political views as his life went on, and his embrace of pluralism was something that happened in his maturity and grew during his life. But I don't know of any case where he made an about turn, no. I hope that's not a defect.
Okay, one last question then. We talked a lot about his philosophy, if you like, of human nature. Was he good with people? I mean, was he sort of working from secondary sources, or was he very able when it came to comforting people, negotiating with people, understanding people? You know, would you take a problem to him?
Yes, some sort of problems I would. I would. He was extremely good at understanding different points of view, and this, I think, comes out very much in his work, where he was able to enter into the mindset of people who were completely different from himself and somehow ventriloquize them, to speak as if from within their personalities. And sometimes it's difficult to tell whether it's him speaking or the person whom he's impersonating is speaking. So he's particularly good at that. He always said that he recognized that he had this ability, but he always said that he wasn't good at seeing what was going on in the mind of someone else in the room with him. And there is a sense in which he wasn't so good in some social situations as he was in these feats of intellectual ventriloquism. He was a terrifically good friend and a wise counselor. I wasn't. I was much younger than him, so I didn't have the kind of relationship that one has with an intimate friend, and so perhaps I'm not the person to answer this question. But in certain kinds of company, and that includes the company of people of my generation, he would sometimes be more of a performer than a listener, if you like. He was very good at conducting a sort of bravura monologue. So that's a sort of half and half answer to your question.
Last question. Okay, two more. Can you take the three questions all together and then let me deal with them as you like? So you first, okay, you've got the microphone. And then at the back, and then...
My question is about your point about national consciousness. And I imagine if somebody, a philosopher nowadays, would write a blog post promoting the virtues of living in a community that is, let's say, mono-ethnic, like more from one culture, then he would be, in US, most certainly labeled racist, because he would be not recognizing the virtue of living in a, let's say, multi-ethnic community. So the question is that a problem with that the views of Isaiah Berlin are kind of outdated by modern standards, or is it more a problem of modern society which has taken maybe too far some things that people say about virtue of living in a more one kind of mono-ethnic community or monocultural community?
So we have addressed the contemporary relevance of Isaiah Berlin's thinking when we talked about Ukraine. And I wanted to ask for some more contemporary relevance when it comes to justifying Western interventions in the Middle East and in Northern Africa. Are those interventions justifiable, and the effects of those interventions justifiable by the Western values we are trying to bring in there? Thank you.
And you, sir.
Thank you. It's okay. My question relates to the idea of nation you referred in your speech. Recent years we have had in Latvia long discussions about the Latvian nation as dominant in Latvia. We even have made amendments to the constitution of Latvia saying that Latvia is, that the ethnics of the Latvians as an ethnic group has dominant position in Latvia. And, well, discussions showed that there is some kind of collision between liberal and those national values. What is your opinion? What could be the vision of Berlin about this discussions? And yeah, that's it.
Okay, well, the first and last questions are connected, aren't they? It's certainly true that multiculturalism of a rather extreme kind has become more dominant in the years since Berlin died, but it was already happening in his lifetime, and he did talk about it. And he used to say that, for example, he didn't favor the kind of succession of hermetically sealed cultural entities which some people wanted to establish within a nation. So, for example, he talked about Cuban studies or Afro-Caribbean studies in universities in America, and if they wanted to concentrate only on their own cultural tradition and not learn about the general cultural tradition of the country in which they lived. He thought this was a bad thing. I think this follows clearly from what I said, what I illustrated him saying in the talk about the need for a dominant culture in any particular geographical location. This is difficult. It's difficult to get clear about it because one of the things that some cultural groups want is to be self-sufficient and self-defining and not to join in with the general culture of the land in which they live. We have this problem in Britain, for example, with some of the Muslim communities where they keep themselves very separate from the culture of the country as a whole. And I think it's clear that Berlin would have said that where there is a clash between the needs of the general culture and the desires of the more extreme cultural minorities, the requirements of the general culture should trump the others. And so he would be in the position of opposing some of the more extreme requests for cultural autonomy within a nation state. And I can't pretend that isn't a difficult position to take, particularly in the face of the modern trend for respecting those cultural minorities, or even putting machinery in place in the state to encourage and develop those cultural minorities. In other words, to make the clash between them and the dominant culture even more difficult than it already is. But I think it's clear which side he would have been on. And when you if I turn to the third question, which was about Latvia specifically, I feel sure that he would have been in favor of Latvian language and culture being the dominant element in the culture of modern Latvia. But he would also have recognized that other linguistic and cultural groups had a place and that they should be respected and allowed to do within limits what they want to do. They should all speak the dominant language of the country, and I can see that in the case of Latvia this is a very difficult requirement because there are lots of people who don't speak Latvian in Russian, so I understand, in Latvia I understand. But it seems to me to follow clearly from what Berlin said that there should be a single national language and that everybody who is educated in that country should learn the language and should be able to speak in it, at least at some level. So I think that's what he would have said about that. And and the second question was about, just remind me.
Would Berlin have lined up with Bernard-Henri Lévy or with Slavoj Žižek when it came to Western interventions in the Arab countries?
Oh, yes. Well, in a way, your question there, it goes to the very heart of what I was trying to do in distinguishing between the general requirements of civilized human behavior on the one hand and the particular elements of a culture on the other. And as I hope I illustrated with Berlin's example of opposition to sati, and the examples I added about opposition to female circumcision and other forms of the oppression of women, so long as intervention is clearly understood to be in defense of shared universal human values and the prevention of the flouting of such values, it's easier to defend it than if it amounts to an attempt to impose one particular variant of culture on another perfectly acceptable variant of culture which there's no reason to eliminate. It's very, very difficult to separate those two, but that's the question that has to be asked in those circumstances. Of course, there's a quite separate question about when it's practical or desirable to intervene, even if we are quite clear that universal human values are being flouted. That's a more practical political question. But so if one is tempted to intervene, you need to answer two questions. One is, are you really defending basic human rights and values? or are you imposing your own? And secondly, the practical question, is intervention going to be productive? And here one can't help but think of what happened in Iraq.
Okay, well, we have it on the authority of Isaiah Berlin, a fine son of Riga, relayed by Henry Hardy, that human flourishing lies in doing whatever we are impelled to do. And I'm impelled to suggest that we should say thank you to Henry Hardy and go and have a drink.